We are very fortunate tonight to have a series of excellent speakers who will help us address this important question. What is G20? Our hope is that their presentations will enable us to walk away from this conference knowing more about what is happening here, about what is at stake, and about what we can do to make a difference. Before we do that, I want to share with you how this conference became a reality. Several months ago, the leaders of the groups involved with this event came together to talk about how we could make a difference through helping each other. We realized that while we do not agree about everything, we share some common concerns. We fear a future where our voices are not heard, where decisions are made for us, and we know that we must rely on no one but ourselves if we want to prevent this from happening. When we learned G20 was coming to Pittsburgh, we knew that the spotlight would be shining on our city for this one moment in time. The entire world has come here to talk of things that will be, and we know we need to be a strong voice in this discussion. We planned this Freedom Conference because we want to promote one simple idea: freedom. We believe in free choices, in free markets, and in free voices that stand up for these rights. We've done our very best to present this conference. Admittedly, we've had some challenges tonight, but we thank you for bearing with us on this. We're grassroots organizers, ordinary people with jobs and families, and enthusiastic amateurs. For most of us, this is our first effort at staging an event like this. But we found strength and hope working with one another, and the experience we had tonight will help us do better as we continue to do this and continue to put this important message out there. Within our planning committee, there's been selfless dedication to organizing this event, and within all the groups participating, the support has been outstanding. We could not have done this without any of you. I thank you all. Even as there were many contributors, I wish to single out 3 gentlemen without whom Freedom Conference 2009 would not be possible. Thanks to their commitment of energy, effort, and support at key moments, Mr. Dave Powell, Mr. Frank Pukrowski, and Mr. Jay Stilla deserve our recognition for their outstanding leadership. Will you please stand up and be recognized? You know, putting on an event like this is very difficult, and these gentlemen really stepped up, so we all appreciate that, and I thank them. Each of us now has to decide what we are willing to do to fight for our beliefs. Our speakers will tell you much tonight about how the freedoms we cherish are at risk. And as you listen this evening, I ask you to consider what you personally can do to make things better. Together, we are making a difference, and only together will we succeed. Even though there's fewer of us in this hall tonight than we might have wished, the one thing that I've learned through doing this is that thousands of people are hearing the message we have through every story on the radio, in the news, and every other source we get out there. The message is making a difference, and we can see this in how people are activated, organized, and political in ways they've never been before. Now, it is both my pleasure and an honor to hand off responsibility for the rest of this presentation to a gentleman who is a passionate advocate of these ideas we support and who has fought many battles on our behalf. Well known here in Pittsburgh for his staunch support of limited government and personal responsibility, our MC for this evening gives voice to the principles we share in the Tribune Review, his weekly radio show on KDKA, and we are very glad to have him here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming tonight's Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Dimitri Veselaris.
Thank you all again for being here. Was everybody able to find a good seat?
Yes.
Thank goodness. It's great to be in a room where so many people can answer this question. Who is John Galt? A lot of people, yeah. I'd have Ayn Rand's dollar sign here, that symbol, an Atlas shrug, but prefer the American flag. We've got 3 wonderful speakers for you this evening. This is going to happen very quickly so we can get right to them. The first is Joan Vion. She's going to speak about the origins and trajectory of the G20, history, Bretton Woods, the UN, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, Patriot Act, the layers of world government, political, social, G20 links to political and economic layers. Tom Woods speak about the dangers of big government solutions, why bailouts fail, failure of regulation, government response exacerbates the problems, and if we can't regulate at the national level, how can we regulate at the international level? I think that's a trick question. We've got also G. Edward Griffin. He is speaking about the history of the Federal Reserve, inflation as a hidden tax, danger connections between international banks and government bureaucracies, and crisis after crisis used to justify the creation of temporary institutions. That'll be the only time I do air quotes tonight. So, our first guest is Joan Vion. I was speaking with her a little while ago and asked her, what is the one most important thing that I can share with our audience this evening about you? And I expected her to say, oh, you know, an author and this, that, and the other. And she said, no, the most important thing that she wants you to know, that she's an American who loves her country. She was in the investment business for 30 years, and she started in Pittsburgh. She's covered global meetings for 30 years. She's interviewed presidents, prime ministers, economists, and CEOs of financial institutions. She is the author of 2 books, Prince Charles, The Sustainable Prince, and United Nations Global Straitjacket. And she wanted you to also know this, that she is overcoming stage 4 breast cancer with the help of alternative therapy. Ladies and gentlemen, Joan Vion.
Hello, Pittsburgh. It is good to be back. This was my stomping ground. I was on the adjunct faculty for the University of Pittsburgh. I mean, I learned to eat French fries on my salad here in Pittsburgh, and I still do it. I love it. It is true. I'm an American, and 15 years ago, I had my wake-up call, and I saw that there was something happening at the international level that was not being reported in our daily news. And I ended up covering my first global meeting in 1994. I went basically because I had a lady friend badger me. Well, you have to go to this meeting. We have to see why does the United Nations want to reduce the population of the earth. And I didn't want to go. I'm a businesswoman. But I found business reasons for why I needed to go. And I determined I would go in and out just one time. And it's very interesting because I saw things happening on the international level that knocked my socks off. Now, before I begin, I would just like to talk about a couple of the things that I have on my table. Next. So where am I? There I am. All right. If you really want to know about the power players of world government, because that's really what we're in and what we're going to be discussing, I suggest you purchase this video and talk about Cecil Rhodes and Pittsburgh's own Andrew Carnegie. Need to know. Next video, 2008 credit crisis. Do you want to know the real reason for the credit crisis? We don't have time to discuss it this evening, but we will continue. Next. The next video, when central banks rule the world. And interestingly enough, as I was preparing for you today, I realized anew that there is no way to get around it. It is not governments that rule the world, it is central banks. What are they? Where are they? What does it mean? Next, the G20, rebuilding the world economy. What? So, what are we going to talk about this evening? What in the world is happening? What does it mean for me and for America? What are the implications of the G20? It is complex. It has taken me 15 years of tremendous research to even get my hands around the complexity. The crisis we face, said Ben Ben Bernanke in the financial markets, as many novelists says, largely arising from the complexity and sophistication of today's financial institutions and instruments and the remarkable degree of global financial integration that allows financial shocks to be transmitted around the world at the speed of light. Furthermore, banks are interwoven. The unfolding of the crisis has shown how completely banks were interwoven with all elements of the financial system worldwide. This was by Paul Davies in 2008. Now, how did I ever figure this out or get involved? I mentioned to you I had a lady friend who suggested I go to this meeting in Cairo, of all places. In 1990, I read a book called Euroquake, and it profoundly changed my worldview. In it, he wrote, a new global currency agreement will be hammered out between 1995 and 1997. Now, he was projecting in 1990 all the things, over 100 predictions, that would occur by 1999. He wrote, this agreement may be the new Bretton Woods that many American economists already favor. It may even be the precursor of a single globe-spanning currency for all the trade zones as a whole. And as I read this, I was pretty amazed. Because you see, you do not have a global currency. You do not talk about a global currency unless you have supporting government, because that is the connection. He also wrote, the new exchange rates will reflect the economic strength achieved by Europe and Japan and the erosion of the competitiveness in the United States. We are at a point today where they're talking about the collapse of the dollar, and I should use the word again. He wrote, the bottom line will be a massive devaluation of the American assets in today's prices, the yen at 105. Well, it's a little bit lower than that. We have arrived. So what was my journey? First, I read the book Euroquake. And it was at that time that I realized he was really talking about some type of world government. But I did not know where world government was. What was its name? What did it look like? Where was it? How come nobody was talking about it on television? In 1994, as I mentioned earlier, I covered this meeting in Cairo on how to reduce the population. And I didn't know anything. I was very naive. I was just one of those happy-go-lucky Americans thinking the world is wonderful. And there I had no other way to explain what I saw. I saw world government. I came home pretty mad. I came home with a suitcase full of material, and as I was sorting through all these pieces of paper to try and figure out how big, how vast, how broad, how far advanced was this agenda, I found one piece of paper. And in that piece of paper, they talked about the fact that the United Nations was going to float the idea of a global tax at another meeting in 6 months. Global tax, I've got to go. And indeed, that is exactly what they did. In 1996, I should say I was hooked. How big, how vast, how far advanced? I made a decision that I would cover as many global meetings as I could. And in 1996, I found myself in Canada at a conference called the International Organization of Security Commissions. Security Commissions. And as I went there, I was talking to the assistant director, and I was looking at how they were setting up the room where everybody was going to meet. And I said, this looks like where the Security Council or the General Assembly at the United Nations. And he said to me, well, we consider ourselves the General Assembly or the United Nations of Security Commissions. That would be like the SEC. There, I interviewed several people, and one gentleman told me about how they were planning to have a global stock exchange. And then he explained to me how it would happen. Then there was another speaker, and he talked about a global accounting system. I'm like, my goodness, we are not talking myth. In 2005, I went to the Bank for International Settlements, and that year they changed their whole accounting system from the Swiss franc to special drawing rights. Now, special drawing rights may not mean anything to you, but they will by the time we're done. In 2004, I interviewed Paul Volcker, former Federal Reserve Chairman, and I asked him about special drawing rights, and he would not discuss it. I might make mention that I was just at the Bank for International Settlements in June, and there, both the new managing director and the new economist refused to comment or talk about a special drawing right. So, that was my journey. What do we know? We have to identify actors and players. We also have to identify the agenda. So that is what we're going to be doing this evening. Let's talk about power brokers. There are very simply two types of power brokers. The central bankers and governments. We can call them individual nation states. So let's take a look at this chart that I put together. It took me 5 years to identify various players. We're going to go through it one by one. The first major player is the Bank for International Settlements. And we will discuss and explain the Bank for International Settlements. You can't go any higher, you can't go any more powerful in power than the Bank for International Settlements. They have the money. Affiliated with them very closely is that organization IOSCO, the stock exchanges, and then all the insurance companies. So this is a very powerful level right here. It's the top level, one that counts. And then we have the international level, the governmental level, known as the United Nations. The United Nations has 191 countries, made up of governments, congresses, parliaments. So again, money and power, governmental power. Carved out of the United Nations is a group called the Group of Eight. And the Group of Eight is comprised of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, Russia. Now, what is the Group of Eight? The Group of Eight was called together initially by Richard Nixon to determine how to economically order the world after he took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971. They began officially meeting in 1975 with 5 countries, and by 1999 they grew to 8. Many consider the Group of Eight a global board of directors. In other words, they are so powerful, they're made up of the developed countries of the world. And if the Group of Eight says that they're going to do something, the bottom line is, what they're saying to all the other countries of the world is, if you are smart, you will go where we're going, because you have to. They said in their first communique in 1975, to assure in a world of growing interdependence the success, we intend to play our own full part and strengthen our efforts for closer international cooperation. I want to call your attention to the word interdependence. Now, then you have other players. You have the International Chamber of Commerce, comprised of multinational corporations, started in 1919. You have the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, started in 1980. You have the World Economic Forum, started in 1973. You have the Prince of Wales International Business Leaders Forum. You know, many people think Prince Charles is a jerk. I mean, stupid. You know, a klutz. I'm sorry, I have news for you. He is a very brilliant, very powerful man. Not only because of the British crown, but because of the power he wields and the agenda he has been putting in place globally. That was started in 1980. And then we have other groups and organizations that my video, 21st Century Feudalism, discusses. The Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, etc. So these are the power players. What is their common denominator? To erase the barriers between the countries of the world. So, no matter what you call it, you can call it world government, global governance, interdependence, harmonization, one, or simply the New World Order. It is all the same, it means the same, and what we're going to be discussing is how we got there. Globalization. Globalization is the process of tearing down the barriers between countries. Oh gee, we better catch up. Keep moving wherever you are. Keep moving. My goodness. Now you know there is a disconnect between me and the pictures. All right, keep moving. There we go. All right, again. Oh yeah, had to do a little extra there. Globalization, the process of tearing down the barriers between the countries of the world. Next, we have to replace national laws with global laws to conform to a world governmental structure. Next. Globalization is required change. And right now, it's the regulatory laws governing the stocks and bond market, the mortgages, banking, insurance companies, all must change, all must go global, not national. And it is, next, the UN, the G8, the G20. So let's take a look at the timeline of events. We first have 1609 to 1930. The creation of the central banks. We then have 1944 to 2007, the Bretton Woods period. Next. Voila. And then we have, next, the G20, finalizing interdependence. Next. We're first going to talk about the period of 1609 to 1930. Next. Creation of central banks. Next. The history of central banking. Long before the barriers fell between nations, powerful and greedy men were planning to control the monetary system of the world. Next. They formed a private corporation known as a central bank that would lend money to the government. Next. The loan would have no fixed period of payment, allowing for interest to accrue without end, creating a bank for perpetual interest using debt-based lending. You wonder why we're in trouble. They who control the central banks of the world control the world, its governments, and its people. I'm going to read that one more time. They who control the central banks of the world control the world, its government, and its peoples. Here is a picture of Edward Wessex, known as Prince Edward. I'm very grateful to him because you see, in studying who owns the central banks, because nobody will make the names public. It's all private. He did a video series called Crown and Country. And in it, next, he shows that King William II, one of his forefathers, was the largest investor in the Bank of England. Next, here is an actual document that he showed with King William's signature. Now, imagine the British who rule the world not being part of a major scheme where they could earn interest off the governments of the world forever. The Bank of England was started in 1694. There were several banks before that, several private corporations called central banks. One in Holland in 1609, and another one in Sweden in 1688. There have been other banks. And then there was the Federal Reserve. our central bank. Next, next, next. Here's an organizational chart of the United States. All right, here is how our forefathers intended for our government to be set up. Next, the Federal Reserve Act, and you are going to be in for a treat. We have G. Edward Griffin, who is going to be discussing all of the evil things that created the Federal Reserve. I'm just going to put it in play for my particular part of the meeting. Federal Reserve Act shifted responsibility for America's finances from Congress to a private corporation. The U.S. government and its taxpayers, you and me, are in debt to this private corporation. And so you see the Federal Reserve, and there are other banks after us, and of course the Bank of Iraq in 2004 is the newest central bank. Next, it prints paper money on demand to lend to the U.S. government in the form of treasury bills, notes, and bonds. Here is a picture of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. I tell people that when they go to Washington, D.C., instead of going to the White House and instead of going to Capitol Hill, they really need to just go down the Constitution across from the Vietnam Memorial and take a few pictures of the Federal Reserve, because there's no way they're going to be able to do anything more than just take a few pictures. The Federal Reserve is not federal, and it has no reserves. What does that mean? It just prints money on demand. It prints money. And that is debt-based lending. So why can't Americans forgive themselves the interest on the debt? We owe it to a private corporation and not ourselves. So the empowerment of the Federal Reserve Act has been greatly expanded. And we have a speaker who's going to talk about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And as they continue with what is being proposed today through not only the Bush administration, but the Obama administration, it will be given greater empowerments. So what do we have? We have an appendage to the constitutional structure of America, and we have this private corporation. So what happened in 1930 then? The Bank for International Settlements. Carroll Quigley, who was Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University, said this in his book, Tragedy and Hope. He said, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole." We're going to see tonight how this has been, how this has come to pass. He wrote, "This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreement, arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland." This is a picture of the Bank for International Settlements. I've covered their annual meeting. I think I've done about 9 times. The only way that a reporter can get in is the annual meeting. Otherwise, they don't let anybody else in. There's no other way that you can even ask the question. What is the Bank for International Settlements? Almost every country of the world, with the exception of a couple Muslim countries, have a private corporation that manage the monetary system of their country. They all meet, as Carroll Quigley said, at the Bank for International Settlements. Congressman Lewis McFadden, who was an ardent American, said this on May 4th, 1933. "Great Britain moved to consolidate her gains after the treacherous signing away of American rights at the 7 Power Conferences in London in July 1931, which put the Federal Reserve System under the total control of the Bank for International Settlements." You want to know who hires Ben Bernanke? It's really not the president. So, it is very possible for a small group of powerful bankers who control their country's central bank all together to control the world. So let's take a look at the global actors above the nation state again. The Bank for International Settlements, the stock exchanges, and the insurance companies. So with that in mind, let's just take for a moment 1933. New President Roosevelt took the first step in cutting off gold from the dollar. And then we have in 1971, Richard Nixon took the second and final step in basically changing, for the first time in history, the whole monetary system of the world. That it would no longer be supported by a tangible, such as gold or silver, but it would be paper. This is from the New York Times, August 15th, 1971. He said in a speech the night before, "Prosperity without war requires action on three fronts. We must create more and better jobs." Next. 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 We must create more and better jobs, stop the rise in the cost of living, protect the dollar from attacks of international monetary speculators. Next. I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators and to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That was 1971. It has still been suspended. So what was August 15th, 1971? It was literally the death of the dollar. Because of it, because of the world being off the gold standard, it is possible to play currencies. You run them up and you run them down, just like stock, just like real estate, whatever. So let's take a look now. We've entered 1944 to 2007. Next, the Bretton Woods period. The international global level of government was birthed. So let's take a look at Bretton Woods 1. Two things happened. First, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created, and it was the beginning of world government. We will talk about the IMF, World Bank first. We're just going to talk about the IMF. That's right, we don't have time about the World Bank. Come next week. The major players were Harry Dexter White from the United States and John Maynard Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics from Britain. They created the International Monetary Fund. John Maynard Keynes wanted a global currency which he called Bancorp. It didn't happen. They also determined to make the dollar the world reserve currency at that time. So the IMF in 1947 became the keeper of the rules and the main instrument, they said, of public international management. They would lend to countries in need. In 1969, they created the special drawing right, which is a basket of currencies. It's used at the IMF as a unit of account. Next. It is a basket of currencies. Every 5 years they reconfigure it. Currently it's 44% the dollar, 34% the euro, 11% yen, and 11% pound sterling. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2003, the Bank for International Settlements changed from the Swiss franc to the special drawing right. At that time, I interviewed the head economist at the BIS, and I asked him if he was looking to move towards a global currency with the special drawing right. And you know what he told me? Oh, no, this is just an accounting entry. Okay, tell it to the wind. So every country has an allotment of special drawing rights. And here, what I'm trying to show is that this is an international currency through the International Monetary Fund where countries can convert their excesses through the special drawing right. And so Argentina has $480 million in special drawing rights. The U.S. has 9,990 million. Germany has 2,176 million. You get the idea. So, Bretton Woods 1, the other thing it did is it created the beginning of a world governmental structure. Let's see how this happens. This is a picture of countries with barriers between them. Individual nation states. Next. Next. Every country controls their own laws, their economics, their politics, trade, health, banking, insurance, etc. Next. Now, this is a country that has barriers between it. This is what makes an individual nation state. Next. This is what we call a sovereign country. Next. So here we have the United States in the middle there, and these are some of the various barriers that we used to have that made us an individual country. Next. The first barrier to fall was in 1944. It was an economic barrier, and that is when the IMF World Bank was set in place. Next. So you see that above the countries of the world, there was this international body. Next. The next barrier to fall was the political, with the establishment of the United Nations. Next. Whoa. Next. 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 It's created in 1945. Let's roll. Every country gets one vote, no matter how big or how small. Every country has an ambassador to the United Nations. It creates laws or agreements called international law, which basically is adhered to. It has its own monetary system, the special drawing right. And it forms the backbone of a world governmental structure. Next. The United Nations has a head of state, a governing body called the General Assembly. It has a currency, as I mentioned, the special drawing right. It has a treasury system called the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. It has its own court and legal systems called the World Court and the International Criminal Court. It has its own policing mechanisms. It has its own oath of allegiance. And this is what the General Assembly looks like. So we can see that as every barrier between the countries fell in 1948, like the World Health, that they have their own parliament, and they do their own thing, and they have their own structure. Keep going. In 1944, keep going. Next. The World Trade Organization was set up. And so, again, we have another structure. And then we had the International... I'm sorry about that. But if you were falling asleep, you're no longer asleep. It's the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is where basically they can try individuals. Isn't that interesting? So we have that. In 2001, it was the military and the intelligence that fell. Now, do you see this structure? This is operating above the countries of the world. In 2007 to 2009, the only barrier left is the regulatory structure. And so, this is what must be torn down. And in order to do that, you need a banking crisis. And we've had a lot of chaos. And in fact, for the first time ever, we had Sir Evelyn de Rothschild in January make a public appearance. This is a first-time thing. Talking about the fact that we needed regulation, and hence the G20. Bretton Woods 2. So we now enter the final phase, 2007. And so when we start taking a look at the G20, we've already met the G8. So who are the G20? To the G8, you're going to add Turkey, China, Saudi Arabia, India, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and Australia. Now, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors started to meet in 1999 as a result of the Asian crisis. The G20 represents 85% of the world's gross domestic product and 80% of world trade. Every country of the G20 is a member of the Bank for International Settlements. Next. Thanks to the University of Toronto, what I saw was the total GDP from their figures of all the G20 countries is $46 trillion. The US has a GDP of 14, Japan of 4.8. $46 trillion, remember this figure. So my question is, the United Nations is to be a place where all countries have an equal vote. If the G20 represents 85% of the world's GDP, what happened really to the voice of all the poor countries? David Faber asked this question, is the New World Order around the corner as the G20 meets? And here, when we start taking a look at the total debt of the G20, it's $29 trillion. Let me just point out, if you can see Italy. Italy has, their debt is 103.7% of GDP, which is about $100 billion more than their GDP. Japan has a GDP of 4.8 trillion, and they owe in debt 4.8. They owe in debt 8.2 trillion. Scary, 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 scary. So, what do we have here? You need to see something. The debt of the G20 countries is 63% of their GDP. Who do they owe that money to? The central banks. Okay? The central banks. Is the New World Order a world in which the central banks rule? He who makes the gold makes the rules. So, again, let's take a look at the ordering of the central banks. They have the banks, the BIS, the insurance companies, and the stock exchanges. Are you now starting to see the picture? Now, in 1999, they did something at the BIS. They created something called the Financial Stability Forum. And they said it was a result of the Asian crisis. And so this is the picture of what it is. The Financial Stability Forum, I thought, when I was there in 1999, I thought, well, you know, they're doing something different. They're adding the global regulatory agencies for the G7. The G8 was the G7 at the time. Okay? And I did some interviews. Swine and Drayson is the general manager of the Financial Stability Forum, and I said, what is the purpose of the Financial Stability Forum? And he said, its work is to detect vulnerabilities earlier and to make sure something is done to address them and to shore up defenses. Generally, there is no guarantee, can you imagine? Generally, there is no guarantee that this is going to protect the system, but the efforts go in this direction. In 1999, I asked him, what is the role of the regulatory agencies of the Financial Stability Forum? And he said, the U.S. probably has, among the G7 countries, the most diverse regulatory structure there is, even within the banking area. It is very complex. The U.S. has a very antiquated regulatory system. Now, what have you heard throughout the credit crisis, 2007, 2008, 2009? We need a modernized regulatory structure. Let me show you what they're talking about. The new change is not Obama, it is a complete financial structural change. They started with the G20 in October of 2008. I tried to get into that meeting and they told me that it was by invitation only for press. And so what they said there was leaders open the way to wide reforms. We then had the G20 in London back in March. This was the bottom line. It was major. They came to a global regulatory agreement. They expanded the G7 or the G8 to the G20. They gave a lot of powers to the International Monetary Fund. They are looking to empower a type of global central bank. And they are looking to discuss taking the dollar off of being the world reserve currency. But one of the most structural changes was a huge, vast empowerment of this Financial Stability Board. They added a college of supervisors. They increased it to the G20, central bank ministers, treasury secretaries, and regulatory agencies. They gave it its own structure. It has a steering committee. It has a plenary body. And it will be comprised of a number of players. If you'll take a look at the next one, you'll see that it's going to have its own plenary body like the United Nations. It'll be comprised of central bank ministers, deputy treasury secretaries, regulatory authorities, and other international bodies. Now, this is no small thing. This is going to compete with the United Nations. Why? Who has the goal makes the rules. Right? I was watching this movie, no offense to the title, something about Troy, but it did have Brad Pitt in it. I did remember that. And there was a comment by one of the conquerors. He said, empires are created by war. Now, let me show you this. Let's take a look at what's happening on the international body with the Bank for International Settlements. They created and they work with all the stock exchanges. So first you have the Bank for International Settlements. Then you have IOSCO next being set up, the stock exchanges. Then they added the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. And so you have that being set up. Okay, so do you see this structure? Then they added the Financial Stability Forum in 1999 with the G7 regulators. Then they added the International Association of Deposit Insurers. That's the FDICs of the world. All right? Do you see this very powerful structure? Don't forget, the countries of the world owe the banks 67% of their GDP. All right? Empires are created by war. We are in war. There have been no guns. There's been no bullets. There's been no physical invasion. There's been no black helicopters. We are an occupied country. The G20 here in Pittsburgh. Interestingly enough, all the things that I researched back when I was reading that book, Euroquake, the protesters, some of the protesters want a global tax. It's called the Tobin tax. We don't have time to talk about it. They want to replace the dollar as the reserve currency with an SDR. We're talking about a global accounting system, a global auditing system, a global regulatory system. Let's go back to Nixon. What did he say? He said, next. He said, we must create more and better jobs. Well, all of our jobs have been shipped overseas. He said, we must stop the rise in the cost of living. The house I bought in Maryland a number of years ago, in 1973, sold for $32,000. Today it sells for close to $500,000. Thirdly, he said, we must protect the dollar from the attacks of the international monetary speculators. What a joke. I interviewed Paul Volcker in 2004 and I said, in 1974 when we had the currency crisis and you went around the world looking for a new mechanism, a new way for the world, he didn't even want to finish me. Right, yeah, okay. Moving on, Joan. When you look at the world today, what do you see based on what you set up? This is what he told me. I think we need a new mechanism. We didn't set anything up very successfully. They all should have been fighting. We have now the dollar at a low against a lot of major currencies. We have a country that has no barriers. There's nothing protecting us or the citizens. Anything can happen. This is what we call world government, global governance, interdependence, one, and the New World Order. In closing, knowledge is power. Reduce and eliminate your debt. Get involved. No more couch potatoes. Plan for the unexpected at home, at work, at church. And cry out to God to help us. I leave you with this, written by David back centuries ago. Fret not because of evildoers, and don't be envious of them either, for they shall be cut down like the grass and wither. Delight yourself in the Lord and commit your way to him.
Amen.
Thank you.